Our speaker is my old friend Eric Farnsworth of Council of the Americas, one of Washington's leading Latin American experts. He has served in the State Department, in the White House, U.S. Trade Representative. He has contributed to Providence magazine. So Latin America is always important, but has been especially in the news of late, especially regarding Nicaragua and Venezuela, among others. So, Eric, appreciate your being here.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. How you doing? So, Mark said, how'd you like to be a speaker to talk to us about Latin America after 2 days of speeches when it's 80 degrees outside on a Friday afternoon? How's that for a setup, huh? And I said, you know what? What did I do to upset you? Having said that, I agreed, but I would like to hopefully keep this lively and interactive, and I'm going to take a slightly different approach than giving you a speech and asking you to ask questions, etc. Because I suspect that many, if not most of you, are here because you see yourselves at some point in the foreign policy establishment. You're here to learn more about how Washington works. You're here to learn from people like me who have worked in the White House and the State Department, various other places. You are here to understand what drives some people to pursue these careers, and you're here to learn, obviously, substance, and you've been exposed to a lot of it and outstanding speakers to this point. I'm also here because I do follow and focus on Latin America, which is not necessarily a topic that is discussed in a forum for national security. And there are reasons for that, not the least of which is that most people don't think of Latin America in that context. And I'm not going to try to convince you today to change your worldview, although there are reasons why I think perhaps you should pay more attention to Latin America as much as anybody else as well. But having said that, I want to link it to the previous speaker. Mark just gave you a real rundown in terms of just war theory and Hamas and some of the issues that are facing our country as well as the world. And he gave you a lot of thoughts to think about. Presumably, you're struggling with some of these topics. Presumably, you're not taking everything that all of us say as gospel, necessarily. Presumably, this is causing you to think, and I want to do the same thing. I'm going to say some things that you might disagree with, and I hope you do, because I worked in the Clinton White House, and people look at the world a little bit differently, and can look at the world a little bit differently. And particularly when it comes to Latin America, folks in Latin America don't necessarily look at the world the way that folks in Washington do, right? They don't have to. There's no reason, there's no law that says people have to look at the world the same way. And I want to take a look at some of the things that are being said right now about the Israel-Hamas conflict and why they might be said, and linking it to all of you, if you do have future ambitions in terms of policy issues and foreign policy, why this should matter, how you can look at some of these issues from a more nuanced perspective and look at shades of gray when the world isn't black and white. How you can look at things, approaching them from different perspectives and understand, perhaps not agree with all the time, but understand why people are looking at the same issues and coming up with dramatically different conclusions. And so let's take a look at some of the things that some of the leaders around Latin America have said about the terrorist attacks of Hamas on Israel. I'm going to read you some direct quotes from a number of leaders in the region. I'll identify who said these, but it'd be interesting to see if you have any ideas of who said any of these, to the extent you follow Latin America at all. You're going to hear a wide variety of reactions. You're going to hear some people who are all in on Israel. You're going to hear some people who are all in on Hamas. And you're going to hear some people who are trying to split the difference. And we can talk about why and what it matters for the United States. And frankly, what it matters to folks like you who are trying to discern, well, what does all of this mean? The president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, said, "I express my strong condemnation and repudiation of the brutal terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas from the Gaza Strip against the state of Israel. May the people of Israel receive all the solidarity of this president and the Argentine people." That's pretty direct support for Israel. The president of Brazil Luis Inácio Lula da Silva said, "I condemn the terrorist attacks carried out against the civilians in Israel and call on the international community to resume negotiations to find a solution to the conflict." Brazil supports a two-state solution in which Israel and Palestine live safely within their borders. Brazil will spare no efforts to prevent an escalation of the conflict, including during its tenure as president of the UN Security Council, where it currently resides. The president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, said, "Our solidarity is and will always be with the victims of violence, without distinction. Humanity hurts us. We condemn without any qualifications the brutal attacks, murders, and kidnappings by Hamas. Nothing can justify them or relativize their most energetic rejection. We also condemn the indiscriminate attacks against civilians carried out by the Israeli army in Gaza and the decades-long illegal occupation of Palestinian territory in violation of international law. In pain, there are no possible ties. Each event is a tragedy in itself. From Chile, we will firmly urge peace in all spaces, recognizing the right to exist of both states, Israel and Palestine, and of the peoples that inhabit them and have a dignified and safe life." That was Chile. Colombia. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all 35 countries, but I want to give you a wide variety and then explain why I'm going into some of these issues. The president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, said this. This is what the Nazis said about the Jews. "Democratic peoples cannot allow Nazism to reestablish itself in international politics. Israelis and Palestinians are human beings subject to international law. This hate speech, if it continues, will only bring a Holocaust." The president of Colombia also compared Auschwitz to Gaza, saying that he saw the concentration camp model of the former implemented in the latter. These are public statements. You can go to Twitter, you can go to or X, whatever it's called now. You can go to newspapers, etc. In contrast, the president of El Salvador said this, Nayib Bukele, "As a Salvadoran with Palestinian ancestry, I'm sure the best thing that could happen to the Palestinian people is for Hamas." What do you think he's going to say? Any ideas? You're right. He's Palestinian background, but to complete the quote, he says, is for Hamas to completely disappear, right? "These savage beasts do not represent the Palestinians. Anyone who supports the Palestinian cause would make a great mistake along with those criminals. It would be like if Salvadorans would sided with MS-13 terrorists just because we share ancestors or nationality. The best thing that happened to us as a nation was to get rid of these rapists and murderers, let the good people thrive. Palestinians should do the same, get rid of those animals and let the good people thrive. That's the only way forward." Now, these are public statements, right? But you already see, and there are others, you already see a wide divergence from countries, many of them close allies of the United States, looking at something that we just heard 2 days saying these are black and white issues. A dramatic variety of differences from elected leaders from around Latin America. I didn't read you the statements from the president of Nicaragua, the leader of Venezuela, or the leader of Cuba. You can imagine what they're saying. They're unelected. But the point being that elected democratic leaders, friends of the United States, are looking at the world in dramatically different reasons. And so if you go and you join the State Department, you're going to be saying, what in the world explains this divergence? Do people just not get it? Are they anti-this or anti-that? And oftentimes, those issues have absolutely nothing to do with what a president may or may not be saying about a particular issue. So let's break this down a little bit and see why would the president of Argentina, for example, say something like this about Hamas? Well, those of you who know your history of Latin America, and I suspect that's all of you because you're well educated and you go to wonderful schools and you have terrific professors and you've been brought up in families that value education. It's supposed to be a laugh line, folks. Come on. It's Friday afternoon. You probably remember or you've heard about what happened 30 years ago in Argentina, the bombings of the Israeli embassy and the the Jewish Cultural Center, the AMIA Center in 1991, 1993. The worst, until 9/11, the worst examples of extra-regional terrorism ever visited on the Western Hemisphere. Argentina has been touched by Middle Eastern terrorism. Argentina has a large Jewish population, one of the largest outside Israel. There is a way to look at the Middle East based on your own personal experiences that may not have anything directly to do with the Middle East per se, but has to do with your own lived experience and the way that you view the world because of that. So the president of Argentina is looking at this not in terms necessarily of Hamas-Israel, but in terms of what Argentina's experience has been with these particular topics. If you're an analyst and you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, what explains that? You have to know that there is this data point that is directly causing a deep feeling of rejection of Middle Eastern terrorism that runs through Argentina. Having said that, let's look at perhaps El Salvador. Remember, Nayib Bukele talking about Palestinian background, rejecting terrorism of Hamas, saying it doesn't represent the Palestinian people, and then curiously, perhaps, linking it to MS-13. MS-13, how'd that get into the conversation, right? You all know what MS-13 is, don't you? Salvadoran gangs, active in the United States, started in Los Angeles, et cetera, but very active. Why would he say this? Well, Nayib Bukele probably believes what he's saying, but having said that, he also is undergoing right now, or undertaking, an experiment in El Salvador, which until recently has been one of the most violent countries, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but in the world that's not subject to active military conflict, by going full scale against gangs in El Salvador and creating one of the largest prison populations in Central America, indeed the world, and certainly on a per capita basis. It's a deeply controversial experiment. The issues in terms of human rights, in terms of due process, in terms of rule of law, in terms of the democratic scenarios are relevant here, right? So by linking his domestic scenario in terms of the fights against the gangs and the criticism that he has taken from the international community in terms of how he's doing it to what's going on in terms of Israel-Hamas, you see that maybe what's going on here isn't necessarily directly related to Israel-Hamas. It's related more, or as much, or at least in some part, pick your representation, in terms of domestic politics in El Salvador, right? So I think these are important distinctions to know, and you could make the same sort of analytical case in terms of countries in Africa who see the world differently, or Southeast Asia, or what have you. Let's talk about a couple others. Let's talk about Colombia. Colombia's statement was perhaps one of the more pointed and direct anti-Israeli comments, to the point where not just Israel, but the United States actually publicly rejected the comments. The Israeli ambassador was recalled. There is a diplomatic dispute between Colombia and Israel right now based on the statements of the Colombian president. Why does this matter? Well, for those of you, again, who know Latin American history and U.S. relations with Latin America, you know that Colombia has been arguably the closest ally that the United States has had in Latin America for the last generation. You're too young to remember, most of you, Miami Vice, but when I was growing up and when I was in your chairs, Miami Vice was a popular program in the 1980s, which was all about Colombian drug traffickers ruining Miami, right? I'm simplifying the storyline, but that had a lot to do with it. The other had to do with, fancy suits and fast cars and various other things. But it was an interesting program, but it was all about Colombian drug traffickers. That was the impression that most Americans had of Colombia for a generation. Colombia meaningfully changed with U.S. assistance and with the assistance of other countries around the world. Not to say that they solved the drug problem, but it did not. The state was no longer captured by narcotics interests or by guerrilla interests necessarily. It was partially the response to billions of dollars of U.S. assistance that was provided to the country over years and years of support on a bipartisan basis. The challenge here is you have a Colombia, which is a great friend or has been a good friend of the United States, now coming out foursquare against the U.S. key ally in the Middle East, Israel. What could possibly explain, what interest does Colombia have in condemning Israel, you ask, right? Well, it helps to remember that the current president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, is a former guerrilla fighting in the Colombian guerrilla against the Colombian state, which he saw as being supported by the United States and therefore subject to the narrative that you've no doubt been exposed to in terms of colonialism, imperialism, and support for revolutionary movements abroad. If that's your worldview, if you came to power having fought literally in the guerrilla forces against the state, your worldview, again, in terms of Israel-Hamas, is probably going to look a little bit different. than if you didn't have that direct experience. Now, he's the first left or center-left guy, left or center-left, I mean, I'm not qualifying him, but anyone from that side of the political spectrum that's been elected as president of Colombia since World War II, right? So Colombia has generally elected relatively conservative presidents. So this has been a shock in and of itself to many of the Colombian people. There are reasons why that happened. But the point is, your personal experience also perhaps is going to determine or at least influence how you're looking at some of these issues. Look, we could go on, but the point that I'm trying to make is this. The world's a complicated place. And if you go into international politics, and I hope you do, because it's a vibrant field and it's a fascinating field, you know, moral certainties are not always easy, particularly the higher level you get. So you're going to have to know where you come from and where you want to go. You're also going to have to know what compromises you can make without losing yourself, right? You're going to have to know when to fight, when to not. But you can be talking to friends, allies, people you've spent billions of dollars supporting, who look at the world fundamentally differently, and they come out with a tweet, and you say, well, why do we have a relationship with that person anymore, right? So what's the relationship built on? What are we doing here? How are we seeing the world in a way that affects not just the countries that we might be dealing with, but our own national interests? Is it in our national interests? I'm not going to answer this question. You have to answer it yourself. I certainly have a strong answer. Is it in the national interest to change our posture toward Colombia based on the president's tweets about Israel? Is it in our interest to condemn if we have a large agenda with a country for something that the president may or may not have said? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is no. It depends on the topic, doesn't it? But I think we have to be a little bit humble in terms of the way we look at some of these issues, because they're not easy. And people in the United States are going to look at these issues differently as well. I want to give you one further example and then talk about a related but different topic. I think I've beat this dead horse long enough. I think the question of Brazil arises. So I read you the quote of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil. And if you were listening closely, you heard a real moral equivalency. You heard, we condemn all terrorist attacks against civilians, completely condemn, what Hamas did, but we support the two-state solution in which Israel and Palestine live safely within their borders. I think that's, in the international context, that's pretty straightforward. Brazil will spare no efforts to prevent an escalation of the conflict, including during its tenure as president of the UN Security Council. Why does that matter? Right? Because Brazil, unlike perhaps some of the other countries that we've been talking about, sees itself as a real leader at the global level. Right? For those of you who know what BRICS stands for, you know that the B in BRICS stands for Brazil. You know that Brazil has traditionally seen itself not just as a leader of Latin America, but aspiring to be a leader at the global level in terms of global governance. Now, there are reasons why it hadn't necessarily achieved its greatest ambitions, but the point is that those ambitions exist, and they continue to be at the international level in the Security Council of the United Nations. Brazil desperately wants to be part of the permanent member of the Security Council. Currently, it heads the Security Council as a non-permanent representative. The point is, if that's your ambition, and you see yourself at the international level as a negotiator, as a facilitator, as bringing people together, as bringing resolutions, if any of you were in Model UN or have done these simulations, trying to put resolutions out there, trying to get compromise, trying to bring people together, what type of a response would you give to something like this? Probably exactly what Brazil just did. Because what's their goal? Their goal, it's a higher level national ambition. It's to be relevant at the global stage and to have the voice to be able to say, we are able to contribute to a solution here in an intractable scenario in the Middle East, but Brazil has a voice here and we want to be listened to. So if we go behind some of the things that are said, it's easy to condemn this person or that person or say that was a great statement or whatever without understanding why some of these things were even said. And if we understand what's driving it, maybe some of the things that were said that we really agree with when we think, boy, I wish I wrote that tweet, right? Maybe the justification for why the leader wrote that tweet had nothing to do with the issue, but because they were trying to curry favor with the United States on an issue that was a throwaway to themselves. And if we are led around by, shallow analysis of some of the things that are going on, we can say, wow, we really support where that person's coming from on this issue. That's great. Let's give them another $1 billion of foreign assistance, right? But maybe that tweet was not because the person saw the world that way or wants a solution to that particular issue, but it's because they have an ambition and an agenda in Washington with the United States. And maybe they think that if they move their embassy, for example, to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, not that that would ever happen, that they might curry greater favor in Washington for their particular national interests. So the scenario that I'm trying to paint for you all is this. As you come to the conclusion of 2 days of fascinating conversations, I've sat through a couple, brilliant people, thinking a lot, but the world's a messy place. It really is. And if you get into these types of issues, you're going to be exposed to this in a very significant way, and that's good. But you have to understand what is the motivation for some of these issues and why they're occurring, and in fact, how that impacts what U.S. national interests could be and should be and are. Mark, I could go on for a few more minutes on another topic that's related, but I think maybe, hopefully I've been provocative enough to stir up some questions. We could go to questions now, or, okay, I'm seeing the head shake. So why don't we do this? Let's go to questions. Look, you don't have to talk to me. You don't have to ask a question about that particular issue if you don't want. We can talk about anything Latin America related. We can talk about things related to my time in government. We can talk about the Chicago Bears if you want to. Not that there's much to talk about the Chicago Bears. But seriously, these are topics that are on people's minds. The second half of this discussion, in case you were intrigued to know what I've just cut out, is a discussion about religious freedom in Nicaragua. So if that doesn't stimulate you, then let's have some questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Sean McGuire from Cairn University. Question about the role of China in Latin America and their growing influence there and their attempts to grow an influence there. How important do you think it would be for the United States to counter that, and what methods do you advise we pursue in order to counter that influence?
The engagement of China in the Western Hemisphere has been arguably the most significant shift in regional politics since the beginning of the century. And I put that above the advent of Chavismo in 1998, 1999, as well as the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the COVID crisis, for the simple reason that it has most dramatically shifted long-term prospects for China. I teach classes on precisely this topic, where we spend a lot of time investigating what's going on and what it means and what to do about it. I'll give you the short version, but bear with me because it's not a black and white question. China came into the Western Hemisphere initially trying to sell more stuff and trying to buy more stuff. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The United States has open markets. We try to buy more stuff from people when we need it. China was a growing economy at the beginning of this century, needed the raw materials that Latin America and other regions of the world have in abundance and bought them at market rates, and there's nothing wrong with that. What China has done in terms of those particular issues is it's taken those raw materials, it's added value, and sent it back to those emerging markets, not just Latin America, but Africa as well, and Southeast Asia. That value added is captured by China, which is generally speaking the Chinese state, and it's not captured necessarily by the emerging markets themselves. Who's getting the benefit here? Well, obviously, if you studied economics, you understand, value added is, production is being captured by China. That's still not necessarily a terrible thing. That's just the mercantilist business model, right, that the Europeans have practiced or did practice for hundreds of years. That's just mercantilism, right? It doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's positive. It keeps, primary producers underdeveloped. But in the context of, is this, the end of the world? No, it's not. The challenge is totally different from that, because that was the beginning of the relationship, and so people became drunk on the idea that China will buy whatever we can produce and we'll send it to them and we'll get wealthy. Well, there was an element of that, but what happens when you get local currency and you have a lot of money that you need to deploy and spend? What do? You buy assets, right? So again, it's basic economics. So the Chinese all of a sudden begin to be having a lot of of currency, a lot of it in dollars, right? It does a lot more if it's invested than sitting in a vault in a bank somewhere. So you take that money, you deploy it in emerging markets, and you buy assets. Well, the Chinese have been very strategic because what they do is they don't just buy random shopping centers, right? They buy strategic assets. They buy roads, ports, bridges. They buy electrical grid assets. They buy choke points in terms of national strategic economic assets, et cetera. And again, it's a global phenomenon. It's not just Latin America. And so they begin to purchase things elsewhere that they find they need from a strategic basis. Again, is that bad? Not necessarily. I mean, if you buy agriculture products, you got to get them to the port. The port's got to work. You got to have the road that gets to the port and all that. The challenge is the Chinese investment model. When you invest, as a Western investor, you bring anti-corruption, you bring respect for the local economy, you bring environmental rights, you bring the expectations of Western governments, you bring all kinds of things, because if you don't, your stock is going to get hammered the first time an activist group exposes you, and you're toast, right? So you export these practices into the emerging markets. Chinese don't work that way, right? There is not necessarily the discipline of the market in terms of how much to pay for certain assets, because why should there be? You're backed by the central bank, the PBOC, right, the People's Bank of China. You're backed by a government that sees an asset as strategic. They'll pay as much money as it takes to get that asset. There might be some money that goes to certain elites to say, you need to favor us, our bid over that bid, right? There might be some money that goes to local editorialists that say, let's look on this relationship differently. There might be trips from elites of the country back to China for months-long reality tours, right? This is China, right? Which are, targeted obviously at opinion leaders. There might be all kinds of issues that change the way business is done, make Western investors less competitive, but more importantly, begin to change the mindset of folks in the local community, right? In terms of democracy, the practice of it, what is corruption and what isn't corruption, why should we care about these sorts of things? Look, if you have somebody coming and offering you X for a certain asset, and they say, look, I'll give you X, but it's going to require a certain shift in behavior to respect women's rights, to respect the environment, to respect transparency so that we have anti-corruption practices, et cetera. And then you have another counterparty over here, not counterparty, but another operator saying, I will give you X plus fill in the blank, right? X plus. I'm not going to care about how you treat your environment. I'm not going to care about how you treat your workforce. I don't want transparency. In fact, we're going to sign these agreements and they're going to be secret, and there may be protocols in here which require certain behaviors that your public won't even know about. And what do I ask in return? Well, the only thing I ask in return is A, that you live up to the terms of this agreement, and you have nothing meaningful to say about Taiwan, or Tibet, or the Uyghurs, or Hong Kong. And that when it comes time to talking about things like, vaccines during COVID, that you praise the Chinese vaccines, or Sputnik vaccines, and that these become your North Star in terms of the Chinese government. The Chinese people have come to our rescue, and the United States didn't do anything for us, right? There is a battle right now in emerging markets, it goes well beyond Latin America, but for hearts and minds of folks in regions around the world to try to delegitimize the Western style of governments, in other words, democracy, and to show that the Chinese Communist Party actually can deliver better results on behalf of the people, and that whereas democracy is messy, doesn't deliver good results, the Chinese communist model is actually much more effective and much more efficient. That's an active battle right now. And in fact, if you go to Latin America, many countries in the region, not all of them, but many countries in the region, you say, well, which is better for you? Does it matter if, democracy here and, the U.S. there and China and most people, honestly, what they care about is getting their kids to school safely and having enough money to buy bread and, put gas in the car and making sure that, they've got a relatively happy life and their kids can have a better life. It's what I want. It's what most people want, certainly what Latin Americans want. And if some guy, in Beijing is saying, I'll give you a pile of money and, you can build a better road, what's not to love about that? And the Americans come and they say, I'll give you less money to buy that road. And by the way, I've got all these conditions that you have to abide by in order to get that money. And the money may be dispersed in 4 years. And if it is dispersed, you have to do all of these reports and justify it and everything else. What would you choose? I know which one I would choose if I were in that circumstance. And so that's a long-winded way. Remember, I said I should teach classes about this, so we could go on forever. But I won't. But the obvious question then is, so what? What does that mean? Can the United States compete? Well, we can't compete with the Central Bank of China because we have a different model. Our investment is private sector led, and you cannot tell private sector guys where to invest and where not to invest and under what conditions, and boy, you can't invest there. Well, actually, take that back. You can put countries like Iran on restricted lists and make investment there illegal or what have you. But in the context of what we're talking about, that's not an option, right? And so you can't say, well, you're losing opportunities in Brazil, so you got to go invest in Brazil. What you can do is, first of all, highlight what's really going on. So there's a whole lot of information space that needs to be addressed. And by the way, both formal and informal information is very much contested around the world, in Latin America, both in Spanish and in Portuguese, and the United States is losing that battle. China's doing very well, Russia's doing very well, and their supporters in Venezuela, Cuba, etc., are also doing quite well. For those of you who have ever seen Telesur, Venevisión, any of these propaganda machines, you know what I'm talking about, right? So the point is that there's a huge information space issue. But at the same time, again, go back to what we think is driving some of these interests, which is to say economic growth, safety and security, et cetera, et cetera. The United States has to have something to say about those issues. So if we can't tell our private sector where to invest, what we can do is help create conditions in the region to make it more attractive to receive investment on certain models, right, in terms of the Western model. And how do you do that? What's the most powerful tool we have in the United States to leverage economic relations with emerging markets around the world? It's the trade agenda, ladies and gentlemen, and I defy anybody in Washington, other than people like me, to stand up at podiums and say, we need to do more trade with emerging markets. Because why? Because both political parties right now in the United States are against trade. So if you're going to take the best tool you have to expand your influence abroad off the table for reasons that are purely because of domestic politics, you tell me how to compete with China. I mean, seriously. It's not through military assistance. We're not going to flood Bolivia with APCs and rocket launchers. We're not, right? It's not through direct handouts, through U.S. foreign assistance. Latin America anyway, in terms of, if you look at foreign assistance flows to the region, Latin America has gone down, 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 down every single year, particularly since we've reduced the relationship with Colombia, as Plan Colombia changed, right? And when you took Colombia out of the equation, the rest of assistance, or assistance for the rest of Latin America, was punishingly low. You take those issues off the table. You take private sector investments off the table, because why? They're going to Europe, they're going to Canada, they're going to Japan, they're going to China, they're going to elsewhere. What else do we have, right? Now, we didn't used to have that problem. When I started in this career in 1990, I started at the State Department. We didn't have this problem. Why? The Cold War was ending. There was no competition. So we could give conditionality for loans. We could say U.S. private sector, is the only way to go. U.S. private, because we were the only ones in town. So it goes back to where I started this very long answer to your very good question, which is to say China's entry has been the most significant change in hemispheric politics this century, because it has changed the ability of the United States to leverage behavior. You now have a competitor who can outspend you. What's the survivor, outwit, outplay, outlast, whatever, that people look at more favorably, and there is a whole dimension of moral equivalency in the minds of many. We got to recognize that. And we got to compete based on our values. We can't compete on money, but we have to give better options as well. There's a whole other side to this, which I'm not going to go into, but the challenge to Latin America of cyber adventurism from authoritarian markets. There's a whole other issue in terms of data capture that's being returned to authoritarian markets in terms of people's personal information, in terms of Huawei technology or Hikvision or ZTE or whatever. These are real. These are real. We don't have time to go into it, but there's a whole, the dimension is multifaceted. So I apologize for the long response. It's obviously a very important question. I think we just scratched the surface on it. Are there other questions? I'll try to do better in terms of the time. No other questions. You still want to talk about China? Yes, sir, in the back.
Hi, Matt Schick, also from Cairn University. I'm maybe building off of the economic aspect of South America. What are some of the barriers for private industry to some of the countries of South America, and what can be done about those barriers to increase the incentive for private industry to develop in these countries?
Well, it depends on which sector you're in. But in general, there are several well-known. There aren't any secrets here. I mean, it's just very well-known. Education levels. Several years ago, I did a quick review, and the average number of years of formal education for students in Asia. Now, this is average. It goes across countries. It's but was 12 years of formal education. In other words, a high school degree. That was average in Asia. The equivalent across Latin America was 6. The equivalent average education level for Latin Americans, this was several years ago now, was a 6th grade education. And if you consider what, if it's not exactly a high class 6th grade either. I mean, it's just, not terribly good. So, you can take whether it's 6 or 12 or 8 or 13 or what, that's not the point. The point is the divergence between Asian and Latin American education levels. Right? That's point number one. How do you compete in a global economy with AI and everything else you all are being exposed to if you got a 6th grade education? So that's point number one. Point number two is infrastructure. Latin America has trillions of dollars, and I'm saying trillions with a T, of needs of infrastructure development. For those of you who have traveled to the region, right? It's not just ports and bridges and roads, but it's all of that. But it's also technology and all kinds of things. If you can't get your product to market, you're not going to market. You're not going to invest there, right? So those are issues. Regulations, right? For all the right reasons, oftentimes Latin America does the wrong things, which is to say that trying to protect consumers, trying to protect labor forces, trying to protect the public good as they define it, you over-regulate the economy and to kill it, right, to stifle it. Regulation can stifle innovation, entrepreneurship, all kinds of things. Regulations around the region are way too high. Tax policies, way too complicated. You spend more time in Brazil trying to abide by your taxes, not avoid them, but abide by your taxes than almost any other country in the world. Right? So if you're trying to do the right thing, you're spending so much money on accountants, lawyers, professional staff to help you pay money. So you're paying money to help you pay money, right? That it's a huge burden on business. And that's for people who are trying to do the right thing, right? So what's the easier thing to do? Tax avoidance, right? Now, if you're a U.S. company or you can't do that because your executives will get tossed in jail, as they should, for illegal behavior. But if you're unscrupulous, there are all kinds of ways to avoid paying your taxes just because of complexity. Those are a few. There are others as well. Customs provisions, and we're not even getting into things like political risk, cost of money, right? Interest rates, currency, inflation, 140% inflation today in Argentina. 140% inflation. We think we have it bad today with what was it yesterday? It was like 5% or something like that, which is high, but 140%. Of course, Venezuela says, hold my beer, or whatever we drink these days, because Venezuela's inflation is about 1,000% or whatever it is. It's just off the charts. There are a lot of things. But having said that, look, other countries have issues too. And the challenge is to recognize how do you address some of those issues, how do you mitigate your risk, how do you operate in complicated environments. All emerging markets environments are complicated in their own way. The one thing I think that Latin America does have to really address, though, on a global basis, do better because they're being compared on a global basis. Everybody else has all those risks that I talked about. But security is huge. Security, some of the most violent and dangerous cities in the world. In fact, if you take a look at just do a quick Google search right now, the top 20 most violent cities in the world. Top 18 of them are in Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and there was one other. And these countries aren't at war, folks. So, if you're an investor, if you go to the capital city, if you're in a hotel that caters to internationals, if you're in an armored car as you travel to your meetings, you're probably safe, right? Or safer. If you're a person, a citizen, and you're trying to live your life, and you're not sure if your kids are going to get home safely that day, what are you probably going to do? Probably going to migrate. You're probably going to try to get to the United States or a safer economy. Hence the immigration issue that we have. So, all these things are related, but some of the countries, there are success stories of countries that are trying to do the right thing, have done the right thing. Chile is a success story from the economic perspective. Uruguay is a success story. Brazil in its own way is a success story. It could be doing better, but it's just a huge economy. Mexico is a success story because of geography, close to the largest market in the world, and linked to us with a free trade agreement. So there are positives here. As well, and let me end here in terms of the question, because of the global energy transition that we're all going through and that we require critical materials like lithium, copper, and all kinds of fancy things I can't even pronounce, if you look at where those deposits are globally, many of them are in Latin America, South America specifically, right? The largest lithium deposits in the world are in South America, in Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, right? But to go back to the question that we were just talking about earlier, who's the ones that's investing in those deposits? It's China. So who's locking in those critical materials that we need for energy transition going forward? It's China, right? Where are we investing for lithium, for example? Well, we're investing in the United States, in Nevada. We're investing in Australia. We're investing, in Canada. And that's legitimate. But look at all of those economies are different from emerging markets. We have rule of law, we have infrastructure, we have educated workforces, we have connectivity and all that. But at the end of the day, lithium is lithium, right? And if you can get it to where it needs to go, it doesn't matter if it comes from Bolivia, La Paz, Bolivia, or La Paz, Indiana. I don't think there's a La Paz, Indiana, but there's a Russiaville, Indiana. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I will conclude simply to say this has been a lot of fun. I hope that what I've been able to do is two things. One is open some interest, at least, in the countries south of our own border, which, unless you're a Latin America studies major, you probably haven't been introduced to at all, or have some sort of family connection, et cetera. It's a fascinating, wonderful part of the world. The people are terrific. The food is fantastic. The history is wonderful. You should go, number one. Number two is expose you to the idea that the world is a messy place. It's not just black and white, folks. There are shades of gray. You got to know where you're coming from. You got to know where you want to go. But people can look at the same issues and come out with radically different conclusions. It's what makes international affairs fun. Thanks a lot for your time.